joining us with the news that the former Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. It is 7 a.m. here on the East Coast in New York City. Good morning, everyone. I'm Errol Barnett, and we continue with our breaking news coverage of the death of former Vice President Dick Cheney. News breaking within the past hour that he has died at the age of 84. Now, we can show you a statement his family released a short time ago saying, quote, the former Vice President died due to complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease. It goes on to say, Dick Cheney was a great and good man who taught his children and grandchildren to love our country and to live lives of courage, honor, love, kindness, and fly fishing. Fly fishing was a favorite hobby of the former vice president. CBS News' Major Garrett brings us more now on Cheney's life and legacy.
In 2000, Dick Cheney was asked by George W. Bush to help pick his running mate. In the end, it was Cheney's name that rose to the top of the list.
He really wanted me to come on board because he thought I could help govern, be part of his team, and that he wanted me involved in everything.
Richard Bruce Cheney was born in 1941 in Lincoln, Nebraska, and grew up in Wyoming. He married his high school sweetheart, Lynn, with whom he had 2 daughters. In his late 20s, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he became President Gerald Ford's chief of staff at age 34. In 1978, he won his first of 6 terms in the U.S. House, representing Wyoming.
I take this obligation freely.
He became Secretary of Defense for President George H.W. Bush in 1989, overseeing the U.S. victory in the First Gulf War. In 1995, Cheney became CEO of Halliburton, the world's largest oilfield services company. It made him a multimillionaire. In 2000, he left the company to join the Republican ticket.
This election is about real choices, that we are talking about the future of our nation.
The bitter presidential contest was decided in Bush and Cheney's favor by a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court. The September 11, 2001 attacks were the defining moment for the new administration. As the U.S. went to war in Afghanistan, Cheney also urged military action against Iraq.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
Baghdad fell just 3 weeks after the U.S. invasion in 2003, but the alleged weapons of mass destruction were never found, and American forces began a long, deadly occupation. Even so, the Bush-Cheney team made national security the centerpiece of the 2004 re-election campaign.
Because if we make the wrong choice, then the danger is that we'll get hit again.
They won in a close election, but as the situation in Iraq disintegrated and U.S. casualties mounted, public opinion turned against the administration.
George Bush has got to go!
Cheney suffered multiple heart attacks, his first at age 37. He received a new heart in 2012.
You wake up every morning with a smile on your face because you've got a new day you never expected to have.
Dick Cheney, a man who was both soft-spoken and unyielding, became one of the most powerful vice presidents in American history. Major Garrett, CBS News, Washington.
We want to bring in Kevin Sheridan now. He's an advisor on the Romney-Ryan campaign from 2012 and also founder of the Sheridan Media Group. What do you make of this news of the passing of Dick Cheney, considering that he was a towering figure, often described as the most powerful vice president in modern American politics, and now his family says he's died at 84?
Yeah, it's hard to explain how important he was actually during those Iraq War days and, following 9/11. He was truly central to everything that America did to respond to 9/11. He's obviously received a lot of criticism since for it. And, he made a pivot in the end away from the current Republican Party. But he was crucial to really everything that happened in those days. He's a really towering figure, going all the way back to the 70s, where he was chief of staff, and he served in very key roles. He was tight with Donald Rumsfeld, obviously. So an important historical figure, and a lot of history books will be written on him.
You know, there is an entire generation of Americans who were not alive on 9/11, or perhaps were so young it is but a distant memory. It truly changed the course of the country. Help people watching remember how Dick Cheney's approach and influence during the George W. Bush years helped shape policy that was passed vis-a-vis the Patriot Act and other initiatives post 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, he took a maximalist view that, and a lot of us who lived through it agreed with him at the time that, look, if there's a 1% chance that we're going to get hit by weapons of mass destruction, a nuclear bomb or a dirty bomb or something, in our major American cities, then we have to take every measure possible to counteract it. And that was the argument that won the day at the time. I mean, 78 or so senators, I think, voted for the Iraq War. It's hard to explain if you weren't there what the feeling in this country was at the time. It was a very maximalist feeling that we have to take the fight to the terrorists. And we're still living in the wake of that now. And the Republican Party has largely turned away from that view completely now. But that was at the time, that was the argument that won the day.
And I think part of the reason there was so much criticism of Cheney's position post 9/11 is that earlier in his political career, and he had been a Washington key player for decades, for many Republican administrations, Cheney did say, I remember this being a clip that would kind of play in high rotation at the time that Cheney was being criticized for his position of going into Iraq, taking out Saddam Hussein, and eliminating the possibility that Hussein could develop weapons of mass destruction. There was a clip from him back in 1992 when he was on CBS's Face the Nation, where he was asked about that possibility during the first Iraq War. If we remember, George H.W. Bush made a decision to go in the early 90s to push Iraq out of Kuwait. And at the time, Cheney said, quote, if we had gone to Baghdad, if we have sort of accepted the responsibility for occupying the country, governing Iraq, putting a new government in place, running Saddam to the ground, there would be significant additional U.S. casualties. So in the early 90s, he had seen that going into Baghdad would have been a liability. He goes on to say, I can't see how many, but the proposition is how many additional American lives is Saddam Hussein worth? And in his view then, not very many. In the mid-90s, he becomes CEO of Halliburton, with the largest oil field services company. In 2000, he leaves that company to join the Republican ticket. And of course, 9/11 truly changes everything. And as vice president, he advocated for going into Baghdad to take out Saddam, which was done successfully. But the challenge was setting up a government to hold Iraq's various interests together. Why do you think he evolved on that thinking?
Because America constantly evolved on Iraq and Iran, and our entire Middle Eastern policy was a little schizophrenic. Actually, we were not partners with Saddam Hussein, but we met with him, and we had we were tacitly enjoying the fight between them and Iran at the time. So it was very bizarre. I mean, it's a complicated history, the 80s and into the 90s, when he finally, Saddam Hussein then got aggressive and went into Kuwait, and then we kicked him out of Kuwait. And that was, we shook off the Vietnam era feelings. And it provided, the 90s that felt good. We finally won a war, but it wasn't resolved. And so that hung over everyone's head for another 10 years. And then 9/11 happens and we go back in. So he's a reflection, I think, a lot of where the country was. The country has evolved right along with him. And whether he was the leading edge of it or whether he was reflecting it, the historians will have to tell us that, but or try to explain that. But yeah, we were all there, those of us who lived through it. And yeah, he was always a voice in it, though.
Kevin Sheridan, we appreciate your insight. Some really interesting points there as we digest the news that former Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. We now want to bring in our CBS News political contributors, Terry Sullivan, who has consulted for Republicans, and Joel Payne, who is a strategist for Democrats. Welcome to you both. On this point of a Cheney evolution throughout his political career. How are you both digesting this news? Terry, I'll start with you on the legacy Cheney leaves.
Sure. I think it's, first, it's a sad day. He was a leader throughout many generations within the Republican Party, within America. I also think, though, that I think he's one of the most consistent elected officials in modern time. No one questioned where Dick Cheney ever stood on any issue. The fact that he didn't want to go into Iraq in '92 doesn't, I mean, those were different situations. We didn't think that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, had nuclear weapons, and doing testing in 1992. So that's a big fundamental difference. So I don't know that his opinion evolved, his perception of the facts evolved, and I think that's an important distinction. But this is a gentleman who's been in public service since he was an operative. He was the youngest chief of staff in the Ford in the history of the White House for Gerald Ford. Prior to that, he was actually Dick Cheney's. I'm sorry, he was actually the assistant in the Nixon administration to Donald Rumsfeld. So he has a long legacy. He was a political operative and a government official long before he was an elected official.
And Joel, how are you reacting to this? What does it mean, perhaps, for Democrats?
Yeah, well, look, condolences, obviously, to the Cheney family. I'm sure they're feeling this loss personally. The political legacy, I think, Terry and Kevin have, outlined some interesting points. I guess first, just thinking about all of the different roles that he played and the kind of ubiquitous nature that he served in Republican politics, almost feels like a Forrest Gump-like quality to always be there, to be kind of in the midst, particularly on the Republican side, but that kind of translated to being, very ubiquitous in national politics, whether it was in the midst of Gerald Ford's presidency as his chief of staff, Secretary of Defense in the 80s, talking about proximity to the first Iraq War, obviously George Bush's vice president. And then actually, if you go to his post-vice presidency, I think that's a very interesting story as well. I don't know if he evolved politically as much as the Republican Party evolved politically, and maybe evolved away from kind of Dick Cheney's style of Republican politics, which is actually at the core of the story of what the Republican Party is today. It's in many ways, it's a reaction to the decisions, the professional decisions, and the long tail of those professional decisions of Dick Cheney and of his allies in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. So I think there's a lot to say about the political legacy of Dick Cheney.
And I think that's fascinating because it may be the lesser known chapter of Cheney's life, post-political career, where he seemed to not only reject the policies of Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans, but embrace that of Democrats. Terry, what do you make of that? Because as you noted, he had been consistent effectively throughout his decades-long career.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
I don't know if I agree with that premise quite. I don't think it's he accepted the premise of Democratic politics. I understand the point you're making. I really do think it is an evolution of the Republican coalition, the Republican Party, away from Dick Cheney, which, by the way, is not just Dick Cheney. There are a lot of notable Republicans. There's a lot of Republican kind of grass tops leaders who the party evolved away from. And
he didn't move or change.
He didn't move. I don't think Dick Cheney changed.
Yeah.
I think the Republican Party and the Republican coalition changed, and that's a fascinating story as well. So sorry.
You won't hear me say this often, but I completely agree with Joel on this one.
Okay.
Look, he's like I said, I believe he is one of the most consistent elected officials in modern time. You always knew where he stood. The Republican Party has evolved a lot. The base of the Republican Party has moved a lot. He was the one person who was vocal about that he was not changing, and he didn't like the changes of the party. He was active. I know in 2016, when I was running Marco Rubio's presidential campaign, he was an active player behind the scenes in the donor community, went out to Jackson to meet with him. He cared deeply about the Republican Party and the values of that. And so I think he wanted to try to keep the party in line with his views. And they stayed consistent.
Well, Terry, what then was the difference between a Cheney ideology, the team, the people he supported, his ideas, his thinking, and Trumpian MAGA politics? What was the kind of spark that separated?
He was always on the more interventionist side of things. He wanted to engage in the world, around the world, in a very Reagan-type fashion. Whereas, as you can see, Donald Trump very much publicly states he wants to pull back from the rest of the world with tariffs and with not getting involved in foreign engagements and things like that. And I think that's the fundamental, the foreign policy issue is the fundamental difference. I also think it's a way of style. Dick Cheney is a very understated individual, man of few words. No one has ever accused Donald Trump, for better or worse, of being a man of few words. And I think that's stylistically, they're extremely different people. One's a New York businessman, and one was a guy from Wyoming. And a behind-the-scenes operator. So I think that's stylistically as well as policy-wise, they were two very different individuals.
Joel, you were going to jump in on that.
Yeah, sorry, Earl, didn't mean to. But just one other thing. Dick Cheney's children, particularly his daughter Liz, I think becomes a part of the Cheney legacy in his post-vice presidency as well. Liz Cheney, one of the most notable, outspoken critics of Donald Trump, and that in a way that kind of became a part of the Cheney family political legacy as well, talking again about this evolution of the Republican Party and the evolution of Dick Cheney and Dick Cheney-style Republican politics. His daughter, which in any other universe might have been the benefactor of the Cheney family legacy, maybe would have been a future U.S. president or U.S. vice president or a very notable leading Republican, is on the outs of the Republican Party because of the outspoken stand that she took against Donald Trump. And I absolutely think that at the core of the tension that created was Dick Cheney and his legacy as well. Because so much of the Trump era is a critique of George Bush, Dick Cheney, George Bush Sr., a different era of politics. So I also think the lineage of Dick Cheney becomes a very interesting part of the Cheney legacy as well.
And it's also fascinating because Cheney himself was never regarded as a warm individual. He was not the person out in front of the cameras selling the policy. George W. Bush, certainly, part of the argument during his campaign is he was the guy you wanted to have a beer with. Cheney, not necessarily. So what was the skill set that Cheney had that in some ways we're now seeing the book close on, because this is an era of American political life that seems to be over, especially with the passing of Cheney. So what was the quality?
I guess that was my point. He's much more of a political operator than a politician. And he cared more about policy than he did about winning an argument. He was much more concerned about being right and driving his policy initiatives behind the scenes. And he was always viewed as a very strong vice president in a role when most people say the vice president has one job and it's to check on the well-being of the president every morning. Dick Cheney took that to the next level and decided that he was going to be very aggressive and active. Again, he was White House Chief of Staff, Defense Secretary. He was probably, in a behind-the-scenes way, the most experienced person to ever become vice president we've had without holding office.
It's a different style of the vice presidency, right? I mean, think about what the vice presidency is today. It's kind of the landing ground for like the next generation, the president's successor in many ways. Dick Cheney was more of a chief of staff. Right. He was more of an operator, someone who George Bush considered as a lead foreign policy advisor. Dick Cheney never was considered to be someone who would obviously be, the next Republican president. He was so much of an inside figure and an internal player, and that served a really valuable role to George Bush, who, let's not forget, was not the most experienced president stepping into the presidency.
No, absolutely. And to that point, they picked Dick Cheney back then in 2000 or in the 98 when they picked him to be VP because of his gravitas, because they felt that George Bush wasn't necessarily the most experienced person, came across as a little too, oh, gee, shucks, and they wanted someone with real foreign policy experience, someone with gravitas, and that's why they brought Dick Cheney in for that specific reason.
Yeah, I think it didn't hurt. Dick Cheney, I think, was in charge of finding the VP for then George W. Bush's campaign. But certainly a fascinating conversation with you both as we digest the news of Dick Cheney's death. His family says due to pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease. Terry Sullivan, Joel Payne, appreciate you being here today. Thank you for your time. Welcome back. I'm Errol Barnett at the CBS Broadcast Center here in New York with more on our breaking news from this morning. Tributes now coming in for former Vice President Dick Cheney, who died at the age of 84. Cheney served under President George W. Bush for 2 terms as vice president, and he's commonly regarded as one of the most influential vice presidents in modern American history. Nancy Cordes joins us from the White House with perhaps some reaction from there. Nancy, we've been discussing the division between the Cheney himself, the Cheney family, and Donald Trump himself, and noted how far apart they have been. What reaction are we seeing from Washington right now?
No reaction from the White House just yet, Errol. The flags have not been lowered to half staff. We anticipate we'll get some kind of statement as the morning goes on. But President Trump has a tendency to be reluctant to honor people in death who criticized him in life. And so we'll see how he handles this passing of someone who described him as one of the greatest threats to the republic, accused him of trying to steal an election, and described him as a coward. Dick Cheney, someone who was once viewed as one of the great standard bearers of the conservative movement here in Washington towards the end of his life, just like his daughter, was very critical of Donald Trump. And as you'll recall from the passing of other major Washington figures like John McCain, who were critical of President Trump, McCain is someone who Trump continues to criticize to this day. But more broadly, in Washington, this passing will be noted. Dick Cheney is someone whose views, whose actions touched every corner of this Capitol. He served in Congress. He served as defense secretary. And then, as you've been discussing, he was one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, vice presidents of all time.
Nancy Cordes at the White House as we stand by for reaction from the Trump administration to the news of Dick Cheney's death. Nancy, thank you very much. Lindsay Chavinsky joins us now. She's the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library and can help us understand the bigger picture and the legacy that Cheney leaves behind. Lindsay, good morning to you. He had so many roles in Washington, all of them influential. I'm curious, as we react to his death, what you think his influence is mostly cited to. What role really left the biggest impact?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. You're right. He had an incredibly long life of public service, everything from chief of staff of the White House for President Ford. He served many terms in Congress, including in Republican leadership. But I think the two that stand out to me are he was Secretary of Defense during the first Gulf War, and that is largely seen as a very successful bit of combat or a very successful war in American history. And so anyone who played a leadership role in that, especially one as powerful as the Secretary of Defense, that's going to be an important part of their legacy. But then, of course, we cannot ignore the time as vice president. And, you know, for most of American history, vice presidents were irrelevant. In fact, there were huge gaps of time where we just didn't have one. And the first vice president to actually have a role in the White House was Walter Mondale. But when we think of a powerful vice president, when we think of a partner in governing, Dick Cheney is the one that comes to mind.
Especially as we look at the early 2000s and the post 9/11 world we all lived in. I remember as they were pushing for the passage of the Patriot Act, as they were making the argument for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Cheney was one of the strongest, most powerful advocates. And ultimately, the Patriot Act expanded the power of the executive branch in some ways, and you know better than I do, but over time, expansions of executive power don't typically reverse themselves. So even as vice president, Cheney made the presidency more powerful. Speak to us more about the influence he had on the size and scope and power of what any future president can do.
Well, you're right. The presidency has expanded enormously in, I would say, the last 70 years. But even in the last couple of decades, we've seen that pattern increase. And that's largely because, as you said, when Congress passes authorization of increased authority, they don't always claw it back. And things like the War Powers Act are still on the books and still give presidents authority, which they use sometimes. Dick Cheney's role in this was important because he was an advocate for strong executive power. He was an advocate for strong executive action, especially when it came to foreign policy and military policy. And because he was such a trusted number two, at least for the first Bush term, he actually ended up using a lot of that authority with, of course, President Bush's endorsement and permission himself. The most famous example occurred on September 11th when President Bush, of course, was in the air, and Dick Cheney was the one actually on the ground. And at one point, he did tell this story quite humorously. Secret Service actually had to pick him up and remove him because he did not want to leave the scene.
Lindsay Chavinsky with some really unique insight into the life and legacy of the late Dick Cheney. Lindsay, thank you for joining us this morning.